Today we'll be interviewing Alice Rothchild, a physician who's worked for years in healthcare reform and the women's movement. Since 1997, she's focused much of her energy on understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I read Dr. Rothchild's first book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, when it was published in 2007. I was profoundly taken by this book because it was the first thing I had seen that examined the situation in Israel and Palestine through a trauma lens. In this interview, we want to look more deeply at how the trauma experienced by both Israelis and Palestinians is influencing the current situation and consider implications for finding a path to peace. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on the show. I hope you have a cup of coffee. I know Alice is joining us from California today. It's quite early out there.
Right.
Really wonderful to have you. So, Alice, in the first chapter of your book, you tell the story of your personal transformation from an American Jewish teenager having, in your words, a love affair with Israel, to someone who, again in your words, began to see Israel not only as a victim of Arab hatred, but also as the neighborhood bully. Can you briefly describe this personal transformation and comment on the factors that led up to it?
Yes, I was born into a sort of traditional Jewish family. I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I had a bat mitzvah. I saved quarters to buy trees in Israel to make the desert bloom. I had Orthodox Jewish grandparents in Brooklyn. And so I come from a very common place for a lot of Americans. And Israel was this fabulous place. And we actually made a sort of family pilgrimage to the country when I was 14. And it was a very uncritical view of the country. It was, rebirth after the Holocaust, a place of refuge, although we would never go live there. And so that was the place that I started in. And I'm also a child of the 60s, so I got more politicized around Vietnam War issues, and then I went to medical school and discovered feminism and healthcare reform, and I really began to educate myself about issues around colonialism and imperialism and racism and all those kinds of issues that gripped us at the time and still do. And this really forced me to re-examine how I was relating to Israel. And what happened was in 1997, I got together with a group of similar sort of progressive Jews who were thinking about all these issues and tried to figure out what don't we know, what do we know. And we started a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group, and very rapidly I began to hear Palestinian stories, and I began to learn about the history that I had never known about, and to put it in the context of my political understanding about how the world works. And also, as the occupation, which started in 1967, became increasingly both egregious and obvious, it became a much more untenable position to just blindly love a country. And so I began this whole exploration and started co-organizing health and human rights delegations to the region annually starting in 2003. And the more I learned, the more I had to ask questions. And so I'm in a very, very different place now than I was as a child. And I understand, I've also spent a lot of time reading both U.S. historians, but Israeli historians, Palestinian historians, academics, really trying to understand how this is actually happening rather than sort of the glorious mythology, which is what I grew up on.
Well, that's a transformation I think many of our listeners are going to be able to relate to. So thank you for starting with that story. Let's start the interview by talking about historical trauma. The idea that the effects of trauma could be passed from generation to generation has been around for a while. But until relatively recently, people tended to dismiss that notion. You'd hear things like, slavery happened 100 years ago. Let's just get over it already. But recently, the science has shown that although it's true that your genetic makeup is fixed at birth and isn't affected by things that happen to you, the epigenome, which is essentially the program that turns your genes on and off, is very susceptible to things that happen to you during your lifetime. So, and that gets passed down from generation to generation in the state that happens after you've been traumatized, for example. So, in essence, you can be experiencing the effects of trauma that happened to your grandparents or your great-grandparents. Can you talk a little bit about the trauma that the Jewish people have experienced over thousands of years and how you think that might be affecting the current situation in Israel? In particular, do you think that the Israeli obsession with security could be related to inherited historical trauma?
Well, I think that there is this kind of, inherited historical trauma related to centuries of anti-Semitism and pogroms and sort of the history of Jewish people that is sort of the common knowledge, although we also have to be clear that, life wasn't terrible every minute. We had Einstein, we had Marx, and you had people who did very well and were Jewish. But there is a long history of anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews as Jews. There's also, I think, something that I would call a kind of cultural PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, that particularly is related to the Holocaust, where even though, Israel is a very powerful country, and even though Jews live successfully all over the world, Jewish people, and Israelis in particular, behave as if we are always the victim. And in fact, we embrace our victimhood as something that is very special. And I think it is also abused. So our sense of victimhood, which is not actually appropriate at this time, then justifies the obsession with beating up anyone who gets in our way. So I think that this is a very direct relationship, and I can't tease out, how much is epigenetic and how much is cultural and historical, but it all comes together in kind of a toxic brew that makes Israelis very often have tremendous difficulty understanding the people that they are victimized. And it also makes the diaspora Jewish world very knee-jerky about the way they respond to any criticism of Israel. And I think this is very unhealthy and is really part of what is going on right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You see sort of a hyperreactivity around this issue that is very similar to the hyperreactivity of somebody who's experienced PTSD. So
right.
I think it's helpful to think about it in those terms.
Right. And the thing that's very painful for me is that if you look at how do Jews behave in, let's say, the United States, we have been leaders in so many progressive movements in civil rights, in women's rights, in gay rights, and all sorts of things. We are very aware of oppression and victimhood and, the underdog. That's like what Jews are famous for.
Right.
But when it comes to Israel, there's sort of this tremendous blind spot where people are unable or unwilling, some dynamic like that, to understand who the victim is here. And if you look historically, the indigenous people who were living in Palestine were displaced and dispossessed by what now appears to me much more like colonial enterprise, backed by the British, and it's a very complicated history. But, the Jews are not the victims in this story. And I think there's a real sort of psychological block that's also abused politically in understanding the current dynamics.
I think that's really true. You do see this misused to try to excuse behavior.
Right. And the Holocaust is very clearly misused. I mean, the Holocaust is constantly evoked, and if this happens, Iran will produce another Holocaust. I mean, that's a very abusive use of a tremendous tragedy, which has had a huge impact on Jews everywhere.
So as you pointed out, in the current situation, it's the Palestinians who are most clearly victims of the situation. So let's turn our lens there for a second. We know that trauma can result not just from incidents of extreme violence, but also from ongoing conditions of poverty, racism, and humiliation. What would you predict the long-range impact may be of the conditions that Palestinians currently are living under?
Well, I think that, first of all, there's not just one kind of Palestinian. There are Palestinians that are living in Israel as citizens. There are Palestinians living in the West Bank, which is very different than Gaza, which is very different than East Jerusalem, which is very different from Arab countries or the U.S. But if we're going to focus on the Palestinians who are living under occupation, I think what is clear is that life is getting worse and worse and worse, and options are getting worse and worse. And, in the West Bank, the system of permitting and checkpoints and the continued settlement growth and the constrictions of the economy and all the things that are going on. And then in Gaza with this really horrific siege and blockade, which has created a massive humanitarian catastrophe, that on varying levels, the experience for Palestinians under occupation is just getting worse and worse. And that has some very major impacts because there's a huge amount of resilience within the Palestinian society, and it is being basically challenged and bashed and challenged. And so the impact of that is, first of all, a tremendous restriction in options in life and rising hopelessness. And you combine that with years of Palestinian trauma and, Palestinians living in refugee camps, for instance, where there are multi-generations of people who've grown up in just totally unacceptable conditions. This hopelessness is very catastrophic for society, and it can have several different directions. People can become mobilized and more activist. They can become depressed and unable to do anything, and they can also become more militant. So in some ways, what I see as the behavior of the State of Israel in the occupied territories and in East Jerusalem is a recipe for creating hopeless people and a recipe for creating more militant people. And even though most of Palestinian resistance is nonviolent, this is a way to create violent resistance. And I think that it's very important to understand that dynamic.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful.
The other thing that happens is I just want to speak to humiliation, because that is a very powerful actor. So if you think about Palestinian experience in checkpoints and with Israeli soldiers, there is a deliberate humiliation of Palestinians that happens on a daily basis. And this is very, very well documented. And not only is that catastrophic for the person who's often much older than the young soldier who's doing the humiliating, what happens is that the children in the family watch the father, the grandfather, the grandmother being humiliated by an 18-year-old. And so this also, Palestinian families have a history of being very resilient and strong and unified. But when children repeatedly see their adult mentors as weak, as unable to defend them, as being humiliated by younger people who are Israelis, who cannot protect them when there are home invasions and all that kind of stuff, this also really has a catastrophic impact on the status of the family. So I think, from a psychological point of view, this is quite disastrous.
Affecting the entire culture as well as individuals. You're listening to Let's Talk About the Middle East. Our guest today is Alice Rothchild. Programming today has been underwritten by the Center for Religious Tolerance, located in Sarasota County. CRT supports local and global peacemakers in order to bring people together across divides of religion, culture, and nationality. Their aim is to build a peaceful future by honoring and respecting our shared humanity. Find out about the initiatives they have supported in Israel and Palestine, Kenya, Honduras, and the United States by visiting c-r-t.org. The Center for Religious Tolerance believes that religion can be a force for peace. Now, back to our interview with Dr. Rothchild. Alice, a recurrent theme in your work is the power of voice. You talk a lot about being personally silenced as an advocate for Palestinian rights, not being allowed to speak, or being labeled as a self-hating Jew or worse. On the other hand, activists on the left are sometimes reluctant to acknowledge and empathize with Israeli trauma, as if that excuses their behavior or would detract from support for Palestinian rights. Do you see these two forms of silencing as different, and do you think they are trauma-related?
So, first of all, I have a little problem in the way that the question is framed, because we're using Israeli and Jewish as if it's almost the same thing, and it's not. So, do you mean Jewish Israeli, or do you mean Jewish? It's just an interesting language moment.
You're absolutely right. I think Jewish Israeli is what we're talking about, because we're certainly not talking about Palestinian Israelis.
Right,
of whom there's
a lot. As well as Palestinians elsewhere,
right.
Sure. So I would say that on the left, and I'm not 100% sure what that includes, that it's not so much a reluctance to acknowledge Jewish-Israeli trauma as feeling that whatever trauma Jewish Israelis have experienced, which we do have to understand, and which makes a lot of the history understandable, isn't an excuse for the current behavior. So I see the silencing as quite a different kind of thing. So, and I don't see it so much as trauma-related, because my being silenced as a Jewish activist is coming from sort of a much more political base. So, for instance, many sort of mainstream Jewish organizations are very unhappy and threatened with Jews who speak out saying critical things about the state of Israel and supporting Palestinian rights. And so the silencing is used in a political sense because, and it may stem from fear, and it may stem from, the internalized personal trauma, but the way it's used is to make me be quiet, which obviously I'm not.
And we're glad you're not.
and so I think it comes from a complicated place. And trauma may be thrown in there, but there's also the whole sort of what's called the new anti-Semitism. This was something the Anti-Defamation League defined in 1974. The new anti-Semitism is now defined as any criticism of Israel. And that is extremely problematic because it's using the trauma of anti-Semitism to muzzle critical thought. And it's also confusing the fact that Israel is not a religion, it's a country. And countries do good things, and they do bad things, and they have successes, and they have catastrophes, and anyone should have the right to criticize a country. And whenever a small group of people circles the wagons and says you can't say critical things about a country, then we're getting into sort of McCarthyism. And so that's sort of how I sort of would frame it at this point. Jewish trauma doesn't excuse the behavior of Israeli government and military.
Absolutely, and as you're pointing out implicitly in what you're saying, silencing coming from a party that has enormous power is, by definition, a different kind of silencing.
Right.
Than something that isn't wielding that kind of power base. So continuing sort of on this theme, there seems to be a shift happening with Jewish youth in the United States. They are increasingly willing to accept and discuss the Nakba and to challenge Israeli state policies. For example, there's a large group who now passionately support BDS. A colleague of mine suggested to me that the fierceness of anti-Zionist Jews in the U.S. might be, at least in part, fueled by the same historical trauma that underlies Israeli fears, but manifest in a different way because people are relatively safe here in the United States. Can you comment on this?
Yes. First of all, I don't particularly agree with that framing at all. I think, first of all, we have to remember that the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement is a call that came from Palestinian society, a civil society. And so it is generated from a nonviolent resistance movement in Palestine. And what we see in the U.S. is people who have critical ideas about the way the Israeli state is functioning and has functioned, responding to that call. And it's sort of the dynamic is much more like responding to the call to boycott South Africa or to boycott grapes or, all the historical progressive boycotts that we know and love in our lives. And so that's, I think, where the support for boycott is coming from. The other thing that I find really powerful is that, I grew up with a sense of what is traditionally called Jewish values, which are really, humanitarian values, but a sense of the prophetic tradition in Judaism is calling for fighting for justice. And so I think that the boycott movement appeals to Jews who took that extremely seriously, but not in a very narrow framework, but in a universal framework. So, people talk about, after the Holocaust, never again for Jews or never again for anyone. And I think that the people who support the boycott movement are taking the message in its most universal sense. And that is actually profoundly consistent with Jewish prophetic teaching. So I don't really think that this is fueled by trauma. I think it's actually a much finer sentiment, actually.
You see this as reflecting what you were talking about earlier with reference to yourself, which is that tradition of fighting for the underdog and for social justice, which certainly, is a major part of the Jewish activist tradition, for sure.
Right. And also, many of us, if we've done this for a while, we have been in educational groups, we have been in dialogue groups, we have, written our letters to Congress, we have done all the sort of lower level political actions that are supposed to create political change. And it hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. So, and we've seen, violent resistance, nonviolent resistance, we've seen all sorts of things. And so I think supporting the boycott movement is saying nothing else has worked. UN treaties are ignored. All sorts of things fall into the dust. And so it's time to up the ante. And I think it comes out of a serious desire to move the process forward in a way that provides justice for everyone and not that supports Israeli power at the expense. I mean, the Palestinians are basically paying the price for the Holocaust and for Jewish trauma and for all the things that we've talked about. And that's not a way to move forward. And I don't know if you just saw Netanyahu he keeps releasing these videos, these bizarre videos. And this one says that people or countries that criticize the Jewish settlement movement in the West Bank are calling for the ethnic cleansing of Jews. I mean, this is crazy talk, and so he's going down this path and taking everyone with him, and it's really, really important to say this is so unacceptable and so destructive and so dysfunctional and so unjust that we need to take, up the ante. And I think the boycott movement is that movement. And it's very exciting, and it's spreading, and it's powerful, and the Israelis are clearly afraid of it because they're spending, and people in the U.S. and groups in the U.S. are spending millions of dollars in attempts to defeat it. There are all these legislative actions to make boycott, to criminalize boycott, or to, Governor Cuomo said any company that supports boycott, New York won't do business with them, so he's boycotting the boycotters. I mean, people don't respond that way unless they're really afraid, and they're really afraid because it's a powerful movement, and it's also nonviolent, which is extremely appealing for lots of us.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. One of the things we know from studying trauma is that victims, in their deep and endless need to stay safe, often become perpetrators. But it's hard for a person or a country that thinks they're protecting themselves from danger to consider the consequences of what they're doing. Knowing this trauma dynamic, what do you think we need to do to break the cycle of trauma and violence that seems to have Israel and Palestine caught?
So that, has a lot of complexity in it, and I totally agree with the perpetrators becoming the victims becoming perpetrators. I think at this point, given that there have been a huge number of sort of dialogue, reconciliation, all those kinds of things on a low level in Israel for years, and with Jews and Palestinians, that the dynamic to change, we really need to change the political situation, because sort of human connection is really not enough. And, it may be that there needs to be something on the order of the Truth and Reconciliation committees that, South Africa did. But I think that the big deal has to happen is that Jewish Israelis and Jews in general need to acknowledge the Nakba, the fact of the Nakba, and the fact of what the consequences of the forming of the state were to the people who happened to be living there. So this requires political action. And it's just like, imagine trying to have peace in the U.S. between white people and Native Americans and African Americans without having any understanding of the history or acknowledgement that this history happened. So I think we also then have to acknowledge the bigger context this is happening, which is that there is a vast military-industrial complex between the U.S. and Israel. There is the whole, fighting terrorism thing going on. There's a lot of other layers to the fact that this doesn't get better, and that people continually recycle their trauma violence paradigm. So it requires many, many layers of work, but I think that political solutions are the ones that we need to be working on.
So I hear you saying that at least we have to start talking about it, talking about the history and how we got here, acknowledge the Nakba, acknowledge the situation, and keep our political activism going.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alice. It's really been fascinating. We've been listening to Alice Rothchild, a physician and longtime social activist. Thanks for joining us. Is there a way for listeners to reach you or to learn more about your work?
Sure. I have a website, alicerothchild.com, and it has all of my upcoming talks and activities, and I have a film and a second book and another book coming out, and that's all on the website. And also I can be contacted through the website.
Fantastic. What's the film about?
The film is, I interviewed Palestinian Americans about their family histories, and then I tell the history of the region through their family histories, and I collected historical footage and photos, and so it's the unheard history. So it's basically the Nakba history that we all need to learn as told by the people who live it. And the Nakba isn't over, it's a continuing process. Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap it up here. If you want to give us feedback on the show, listen to archived interviews, or share ideas for topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East. You can also find our podcasts on the CRT website. Take